And then finally, Chris Roberts, who is, I don't know what your real title is, but pension researcher at the Canadian Labour Congress, based in Ottawa. I work with Chris also regularly.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Kevin. I also want to thank Kevin and congratulate him on putting together this remarkable series of discussions with excellent readings.
It's Greg and Sam, I should have said.
And everyone else, but I think if nothing else, it's an advertisement for the benefits of negotiated education leave, because Kevin didn't have time to breathe, much less reflect on these weighty issues when he was literally 50% of the pension staff in a union of 600,000 people. So you can imagine how busy he's been over the last little while. I'll try to be quick because I get the sense that people really want to begin to contribute and start the discussion. I will start by saying, and not leave it to any later in my remarks, that these really are my own perspectives and not those of my employer necessarily. I want to zoom out a bit and pick up on Kevin's opening remarks and really ask some difficult questions about the contradictions of private pensions in particular. The title of this inaugural workshop is, of course, taken from Peter Drucker's 1976 book. His thesis was that, unnoticed, workers through their pension funds had come to own the controlling interest in much of American business, with various implications for the U.S. economy and business management that Drucker goes on to explore in his book. The main thing I want to say here is that I think there's an urgent need in the labor movement to understand and appreciate not how pensions have somehow assumed ownership and potential control of capital, but rather the fact that workers' retirement savings through private pensions have really assisted the development and growth of today's financialized capitalism. And they've become dependent on and subordinate to the imperatives of accumulation in an age of global financial capital. And that's a really difficult thing to kind of come to grips with and to wrestle with the consequences of that. And I don't think we've done a good job of doing that inside the labor movement. We spend a lot of time discussing the shortcomings of private pensions in terms of inadequate and declining coverage, underfunding risk, insolvency risk, but not so much on the investment side. So I really am appreciative of Kevin's efforts to put this together because it's such an important and difficult and painful discussion, but a necessary one. So when I say that workers' retirement savings have become subordinate to capital, I'm not referring narrowly to how pension assets from the 1970s onwards have become to be used to fund downsizings and corporate restructurings, or invest in firms that bust unions and flee unionized workforces, close plants, and engage in a lot of unscrupulous behavior. But in a larger sense, I'm posing the challenge, I think, to us all that there's an historical process through which retirement provision was made subordinate to and directly dependent on capitalist accumulation, and we're living with the consequences of that today. And that's not a recent development. In fact, it predates Drucker's observations by decades. But it was created through a series of historical compromises made partly in the labor movement, the reluctant withdrawal from public provision of pensions, retirement income, the embrace of private pensions, or what Simon Archer calls employer-centric pension provision, which we're now coming to grips with the profound deficiencies and limitations of as a system. I just want to make the case that the development of employer-sponsored and funded pensions with assets held in trusteed pension funds was important to the post-war expansion of financial capital that has played such an important role in creating the conditions for and the turn to neoliberalism that we've struggled with as unions, trade unionists, over the last generation. It's important to remember that the earliest pension plans set up in the civil service and the railroads were part of corporate welfare schemes in the 1920s. These were all essentially pay-as-you-go schemes, and the retirement allowance would be paid as workers became eligible, or more often salaried, white-collar, or managerial employees. But in the late 1920s, firms increasingly took the decision to fund pension benefits during an employee's active years at work. But even then, most of this funding was just balance sheet reserves, internal corporate accounts, and the trusts were revocable at the whim of the sponsor, so the sponsor could just decide to not offer the pension. There was no contractual entitlement to an annuity on retirement. So advanced funded trusts, in which cash from corporate assets was transferred to plan trustees who then purchased securities in financial markets, only really date from the 1920s. And many of these early trusts weren't much more than balance sheet reserves in any case, in which pension obligations were matched by a bookkeeping claim against the sponsor. And in the 1920s and early 30s, cash held in these early trusts was often used to purchase bonds directly from the sponsor. There was an effort, with all the deficiencies in this system, to formalize these pension claims and protect plan beneficiaries. And both labor and government took steps to create the modern form of trusteed pension funds invested in capital markets. So Congress took steps in the late 30s and 1940s to formalize these pension entitlements, forbid denying tax advantages to revocable pension trusts and the like. And after World War II, when the political conjuncture really closed off the possibilities of expanding Social Security, which the labor movement had supported quite strongly, given the history of private pensions as welfare capitalist mechanisms by which management controlled workers, of which they were very skeptical. When the political conjuncture made that impossible, they turned reluctantly to the expansion of private pensions. But they wanted pre-funded pensions with trusteed funds. So the 1950 UAW-GM agreement, for instance, at the really as an offer from management, established a pension plan with an investment trust whose assets would be managed externally by professional investment managers, and whereas assets largely heretofore had been invested in government bonds, fixed income securities, now they would be invested in equities. And famously, the UAW then struck Chrysler for 104 days in that same year to force them to also go along with the notion of a fully funded plan instead of the alternative. So by the early 1950s, funded pensions and trustee pension funds were increasing rapidly, and far from this being the revolution no one noticed, as Drucker put it, it was widely remarked at the time. In Canada, trustee pension funds after World War II were becoming a source of growing interest for financial institutions. There was a 1953 Dominion Bureau of Statistics survey of Canadian trustee pension funds that noted the increasingly important role of trustee pension funds in capital markets. In 1959, Paul Harbrecht wrote in Pension Funds and Economic Power, recently enthusiastic proponents of pension and profit-sharing funds have been hailing them as instruments for creating a people's capitalism. But it should be obvious that the typical beneficiary is, in his present situation, neither a proprietor nor an owner. He enjoys none of the prerogatives of management and direction that usually pertain to ownership or proprietorship. So the Drucker was effectively answered 16 years before writing the book. But it wasn't just academics and other consultants that noticed this. Governments were aware of this as well. So in 1962, President Kennedy ordered a review of the implications of the growing retirement and welfare funds for the financial structure of the economy, as well as a review of the role and character of private pensions and other retirement systems in the economic security of the nation. And the development of funded trusts and the efforts to improve their funding mechanisms had significant ramifications for the integration of workers' retirement savings into capital markets. These efforts both helped accelerate pension fund asset growth, but also spread the dependence throughout the system as a whole. And this was quite an interesting development. In the words of a leading historian of private pensions, diversifying pension fund assets away from sponsor securities broadened the plan's base of support. Benefit payments would derive not just from the employer's future cash flow, but from cash that arrived from other organizations via trust fund securities. It came from dividends, interest payments, rents, royalties, or the sale of these financial claims. To the extent that private pension funds held claims on the corporate sector, the institution as a whole could be viewed as a balance sheet reserve for corporate America. So it wasn't just that Walter Reuther and other labor leaders after World War II worried that company pensions would tie workers to the company and become a management weapon against workers, or that the funding, investing in the sponsor's own securities would be a risk for the plan beneficiaries. It was also about laying the basis for dependence on capital markets as a whole. So the contradictions of this process became apparent in the transformation of capitalism in the 1970s and 1980s. Pension funds stimulated and benefited from the enormous expansion of the financial system that formed part of the defeat of labor and inflationary expectations in the late 1970s and 1980s, and then imposing neoliberal market discipline. And I'll just give you an example. Writing in 1989, Zweibody dated the unprecedented wave of financial innovation in the U.S. capital markets to 1974, which was the year of far-reaching pension regulatory reform in the United States, arguing that these developments, this unprecedented wave of financial innovation, can be explained by the nature of the benefits guaranteed by defined benefit pension plans and the investment strategies they employed to hedge their liabilities. And he's talking about the explosion of derivative securities and financial innovation, that there was an enormous appetite for these sorts of financial securities from pension plans to deal with interest rate risk and political risk. So pension funds were a significant source of demand for financial innovation, and with it, the liberalization and expansion of financial capital that stimulated then an increase in the 1980s in the asset management industry and financial services, consultancies, insurance companies, etc., and really drove a lot of the excesses of that period, the search for higher returns, the problem of short-termism, and the emphasis on shareholder value, which encouraged financial engineering and mergers and acquisitions and asset stripping and all the rest. There's another aspect to this which is really disturbing, and that is that financialization made it possible to entertain the notion of individuals taking responsibility for retirement income provision by becoming direct market participants and investors themselves. You needed those deepened and broadened financial markets to even envisage the idea that individuals could now become responsible through the management of their individual retirement accounts and their DC accounts become responsible for managing their retirement savings. And pension plans had an important role in creating those conditions for that to happen. So it wasn't accidental that the US government made IRAs possible in 1974 and 401ks become possible in 1978. Again, part of this expansion of financial markets driven by pension funds. Then, ironically, we're now living also in the wake of a financial crisis, a very serious global financial crisis that was a product of this enormous transformative expansion of financial capital that led central banks around the world to drop interest rates in a bid to inject liquidity into the system and prevent complete seize up in credit markets and in lending, with the consequences that the cost of DB pension plans has gone through the roof, and the attack now is just being overwhelming, given the costly nature of these plans in a very low and prolonged low interest rate environment. Okay, so where are we now then, and given that context? Well, what we haven't talked about tonight, and I think is really important, is some of the questions and proposals raised by Robin Blackburn in his very interesting book about how to dig our way out of this historical development. I just want to say first something about responsible investment or gaining control. Union trustees or union representatives gaining control of pension funds, that also isn't a new idea. That stretches back to the post-war period. The AFL-CIO sought joint pension investment boards after World War II. The UAW proposed joint trusteeship to the Detroit 3 employers. And for the union organized multi-employer plans that had grown up out of the old mutual aid pacts before World War II, you had direct kind of involvement of union leaders in shaping investment decisions undertaken by these multi-employer plans, and Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters was kind of the best example of that, where Hoffa leaned on trustees to make all sorts of dubious loans to Las Vegas casino operators and the rest, but that was an instance of kind of pension fund activism. But there were other.
There's a reason why he didn't collect a pension, right?
It's dangerous.
Trustees all end up buried somewhere.
But there were more progressive instances. So for instance, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union had an agreement with Chase Manhattan Bank to set up a special division of mortgage loans that would give provisions to working class applicants, that would give preference to them. And others, but none of these really influenced the general development of financial markets and pension funds' role involvement in financial markets in ways that would return to haunt workers. So where are we now? Well, I just want to say a quick few concluding things about responsible investment and what Blackburn sets out. And again, these really are my own opinions. I think there are some important, really interesting things around pension fund activism, but they're limited. In the first instance, unions are always engaged in campaigns against employers. The employers obviously have the power, it's an asymmetric relationship. So unions naturally, with their allies, take advantage of all leverage points that they can. So steel workers or here up against an employer will seek to leverage the influence of investors who are concerned about reputational risk and financial risk of being involved with an employer that's being very intransigent with their workers. And so in the context of corporate campaigns around organizing, around getting a contract, it has been useful and an important part of those campaigns against employers to get investors to weigh in. And then the Porter example was a logical case where you would go to the investor and try to get them to intervene, and those can be successful in instances. They're important, I think, because they're involved. They're rooted in real struggle of members, and you have to educate members, and you can inform them about what you're doing as part of the strategy. It involves you organically out of struggle in that respect. It's not reserved to trustees in a boardroom cutting deals. The other is divestment campaigns that are going on campus, for instance, where I'm thinking of the fossil fuel divestments that many student groups and campus groups have organized to force their universities or colleges to divest from fossil fuels. That again arises out of a very real political and organic movement or campaign, and in that respect it can be important and useful to extend that to asking questions about where universities are invested. Beyond that, I'm not going to say much about responsible investment, but I just want to go to Robin Blackburn's thesis, which or his proposal, which hasn't come up for discussion. And as I see it, there's some conflicting elements in Blackburn's project, but I think what he's really talking about, what I find most interesting in his proposal, is that he's talking about the need, and I think this is really important for the labor movement to come to grips with, and it's kind of like the horizon because it's so difficult to wrestle with, but the desperate need to socialize and democratize control over strategic economic decision making. I mean, it's ridiculous that we have decisions about workers' livelihoods and the economic well-being of communities that are made by a handful of people in a room. So what Blackburn's talking about, the need to gain control over those decisions and find ways to socialize and really democratize those decisions, I think is key. And he proposes a plan to force companies to issue shares that would go into a pooled fund that would then be really controlled by workers and plan beneficiaries in a very democratic fashion. And then that raises all kinds of interesting questions that Sam Gimlin has raised about, well then how do you do an audit of a community when you have these social funds about what the needs are? Not the needs as determined by the marketplace or by profit requirements, but what are the needs we have in this community? What capacities do we have? What sort of unemployed or underemployed skills and capacities do we have? And how can we direct investment in ways that are not defined and limited by commercial requirements to address those needs and put those capacities to work? And that would require educating people and involving them and bringing them in as participants in that whole process. And what an amazing transformative process that would be. But having said that, it's important to realize that I believe that if that were a real proposal with legs on the agenda today, that it would be pension funds that would be at the head of the line opposing that strategy, because forcing firms to issue shares into a pooled fund would dilute their own holdings, the value of their holdings in those firms. And they would certainly not back a windfall tax on commercial property values that would also be used to support that fund. So we've got to also come to grips with that there's real opposition from the investment that funds have in the status quo. And with that, I think I'll just leave it there because I think people probably have a lot to contribute, and I'm curious to hear what people have to say as well. Thank you.